Okay, welcome everyone. It is Thursday, January, let's see, what is the date today? 28th?
28.
Yeah, January the 28th, 2021. And tonight we are hosting again Colonel John Somerville from Zion's Watchman. And he is going to continue his series on the accidental US presidents who became blessers of Israel. And so far, what John has established and taught us is that the reason for these presentations and the reason for us gathering is to learn and come to understand that nations rise and fall based on two biblical foundation principles, which are number one, how a nation treats the land of Israel, and number two, how a nation treats the Jewish people, all based on Genesis 12:3. So we've had some extraordinary presentations by John over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and everybody has got a copy of those recordings, and I encourage you to share those with your friends. And he's going to be presenting on another president tonight, and then next week I think he's going to talk about President Trump. So that will conclude his overview of these 5 presidents that he's highlighted and the presentation on the fall of Great Britain. So he's laid the groundwork for us, and I'm excited to hear him tonight. I just want to remind everybody that these presentations are being sponsored by Ann Stacy, who has the nonprofit Texans for a Safe Israel. You can look up her website and see all the work that she does. It's also sponsored by my business, which is A Taste of Israel. And so if you want to see what I do for right now, it's been reduced to a blog about Israel. I used to take groups over to Israel before COVID. Hopefully we'll get that started up again sometime in the near future. So that's that. Let's see. Just a general state of our minds. I know we are, into the new administration here in America, and this is going to impact how we're going to watch see how they treat Israel and the Jewish people. And I just have to say, on this day, it's not looking so good. So they just reinstated going back to funding the Palestinian terrorists, their pay to slay program. So I'm very concerned about that. Plus, they were talking about possibly going back into the Iran deal. So we have a lot to be concerned, a lot to pray about. We do know God's in control. And like John said last week, God can use anybody. So things are going to go the way God wants them to go regardless. So with that, even though it's discouraging, we have a lot we can do on our end, which is to be encouraged, to continue to pray, continue to push back at the local level, get behind people that are running for school boards, for sheriff, for city council, that have a biblical worldview that will benefit both Christians and Jews. And so I don't want us to be too discouraged. I want us to, this is the time to stay vigilant, time to stay in the game, not to retreat and get freaked out and live in fear. We're needed now more than any other time, I think. So with that said, I think I'm going to turn the mic over to John and let him begin his presentation. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Lori. Last week, I think I went about 100 miles an hour, and that was on Lyndon Johnson. And I felt like I just went way too fast on it. So tonight, I'm going to try to do 2 presidents in one time period. And each one of them certainly is worth an hour and a half. So we'll really be rolling along here. I want to share the screen here a minute and try to find the right situation. Okay. I want to start with this. This is in Romans 13, 1-6. And I think just what Lori was saying, we, and I'm talking about myself mostly, I can't look into other people's minds and hearts, but most of the people I know, they knew how much I appreciated Donald Trump and worked as hard as we could, doing everything we could think of to make sure people would vote for him. And then it was like certainly more than a kick in the stomach to have to live with the outcome of that, whether no matter what you think about how it happened. But I wanted to go to Romans 13, verses 1-6 to start with. It says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. Now, pay attention particularly to this sentence. For he, meaning the ruler, is God's servant to do you good. And then it continues, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He's God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it's necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Many people have argued through the centuries that revolting against government leaders is forbidden by Scripture. But Romans 13 includes an important qualifier in verse 4. For he is God's servant to do you good. When a government violates God's laws and when leaders become dishonest, cruel, and oppressive to maintain their power, they're doing no good. God warns all government rulers that they will have to give an account for their actions. Psalm 2, 10-12 says, therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. The Bible teaches that man's first and highest duty is to obey God. Let me repeat that because that's really important. The Bible teaches that man's first and highest duty is to obey God. That's why church-state governments can be so dangerous. When man's laws run contrary to God's laws, civil disobedience is warranted. When Jewish leaders forbade the disciples from speaking about a resurrected Jesus, Peter and the other apostles said, we must obey God rather than men. Jesus highlighted the concept of God first when he repeated the first and greatest commandment. He said, love God with all our heart, mind, and soul. And the second commandment is that we must love our neighbors as ourselves. Then Jesus said, so give back to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what is God's. There's a few scriptures that talk about this, about how God changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and he raises up others. And I really believe that this happened in the cases of some of these presidents that we've talked about or will talk about. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. God can certainly move hearts of leaders. And this is talking about the king's heart. Psalm 75, lift not up your horn on high, speak not with a stiff neck. For promotion cometh neither from the east nor the west, nor from the south. But God is the judge. He putteth down and he setteth up another. No government's perfect. One of the chief virtues of a democracy, however, is that its defects are always visible and under democratic processes can be pointed out and corrected. The battle we're in is a spiritual battle. It's a spiritual battle for the soul of our nation. Not only that, it's bigger than that. It's a battle against demonic forces, a demonic battle to diminish and deny God's covenant promises. And that's how it really brings us back to our connection to Israel. Some of the questions that I've asked myself for many years was, does God intervene in elections? That's what got me started on the studies of these presidents. Or do we, in this particular method of government that we have, do we get just what we deserve? Or how do we get out of this mess? And I can't answer all of these questions, but I want to start by taking a look at this little boy there with his leg crossed is little
Excuse
Richard Nixon.
John, excuse me 1 second for interrupting.
Yeah.
I just wanted to step in for a second and say, John has a glitchy connection where he's at tonight. So sometimes he may sound like he's talking slow and then sometimes speeding up. It's not really bad, but it is kind of coming in a little bit, but it's fine. I just wanted everybody to be aware that's what's going on. Thank you, John. Go ahead.
Okay, when it gets really bad, just grab your ears and
okay, it's not horrible, but I just wanted to say that.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm sorry about that. This is, I want to talk for a few minutes about Richard Nixon. And Nixon's parents were Quakers, and his mother especially. His father was kind of in and out of it and was a pretty tough father. And anyway, this is a picture of Richard that was on Life magazine talking about Nixon's childhood. And it looks like he's got a violin there. And I never could find anything about his violin skills, but he learned to play the piano very early. And he often played it whenever one was near. And Harry Truman was another piano player. And of course, Truman was a Democrat. And when Nixon was president, and of course, a Republican, he went to visit Harry Truman, who was pretty crotchety by that time. And Nixon sat down and started playing the piano. And Truman just made some remarks about what a lousy piano player he was. Anyway, one of the things that probably affected Richard Nixon, and he certainly talked about it many years later when he was in his 60s in 1973 and 1974, he said that his mother said this. And I have no way of doubting that. He wasn't like Lyndon Johnson, who told many, many different stories about a same event. Nixon, being a politician, probably changed it around a little bit himself, but he said in response to the time that Golda Meir called in the middle of the night asking the United States for help because they literally were on the edge of not only losing the war in 1973, but in fact, they were bringing out their nuclear weapons, which they had, of course, always denied that they had, but they were about to put their nuclear bombs on these Jericho missiles that they had. And this really got everyone's attention, especially Kissinger and the others. And this phone call came through, literally begging the United States for help. And Richard Nixon said, this reminded me, it sounded like the voice, even though he didn't talk to Gold on that phone call. Oftentimes the story is made bigger than it probably was. But he said, it reminded me of my mother saying, one day, Richard, you will be in a powerful position and a situation will arise where the Jews will need your help. When it does, you are to help them. Now, a little something about Richard Nixon and that we know about him that most people didn't know at the time was because he was taping everything in the White House for years. And while he was doing that, he really revealed one side of himself that if you only heard those tapes and you didn't know anything else about him or what he was going to do, you'd say, he is the worst, biggest anti-Semite there's ever been in the White House, because everything was the Jews this and the Jews there, and there's too many Jews in the government and we got to get, and it's the Jews this. What he really was saying was, it's the Jewish Democrats who hated him with a passion. And I remember during those days, I couldn't understand why people hated him so much. It's kind of like the way they hate Trump these days. They're just, you can't even talk to them about it, or there's no use even trying to start a conversation. Nixon felt that way about Jewish Democrats because they would never vote for him. And the odd thing is, he had lots of Jews around him in his government. Kissinger was one. And there's a half a dozen or more who held high, even cabinet positions. But he didn't seem to mind in front of them saying these things about the Jews. And I think most of them understood that he was talking about the Democrats. And one of the people that was caught on tape, and it wasn't revealed until years later, was actually Billy Graham. And you can imagine if you were sitting in the Oval Office with the president, and the president starts ranting and raving about the Jews, I think that who've had experience now working with anti-Semites and hearing these kind of things, if nothing else, you might speak back, or you might just remain silent. But Billy Graham didn't. Billy Graham just kind of chimed in and went along with the whole thing. And when this was revealed many years later, it was really a black mark on Billy Graham for doing that. But you can kind of understand it. Here's the president of the United States, probably at the time one of the, if not the most powerful person in the world. And he's talking directly to you and trying to draw this out of you, and you give into it. And I'm sorry that it happened that way, but he had also surrounded himself. But here was Kissinger, his closest advisor, who obviously was a Jew, and Nixon could say these kind of things. Also on those tapes was Kissinger saying some things that he's had to be very embarrassed about in the last few years. And one of the things he said when Israel was being attacked was, well, let's let them bleed for a while. And then we'll be able to maneuver them more when we go in and we start to negotiate with them. Well, that let them bleed for a while just really also marked Kissinger as somebody who could easily fall into these anti-Semitic ideas. These are, I'm going to skip over this one. I'm going to go to this one. And what I want to talk about is not the quirky things that Nixon did, but the one time that of what he did, I think really elevates him to the point where he was a blessing to Israel. And this series of pictures I put together today shows kind of starting in the upper left-hand corner, it's Henry Kissinger on the phone. And this is prior to the 73 Yom Kippur War. And he's in a conversation with Golda Meir. And Golda Meir is saying, actually, this is the day that Israel was attacked, but the attack hadn't started yet. And Golda was saying the Egyptians are making moves like they're coming to the canal, to the Suez Canal. And it looks like the Syrians are starting to move toward the Golan Heights. And Kissinger is giving out the same advice that Lyndon Johnson gave out to Israel in 1967. And he said, don't be the first one to hit them. And it's because in 1967, the same thing was about to happen, although there were 5 armies coming against Israel, and Israel struck them first and wiped out the Air Force in Egypt and the Air Force in Syria. And then it was a whole different ballgame. But for some reason, our State Department, and by this time, Kissinger was not only the Secretary of State, he was also the National Security Advisor. So he had 2 big systems that he was in charge of. And he's saying the same thing that others had said, don't be the first to start it. It's kind of like, even though an army is lined up ready to roll over you, don't you be the one that goes out and hits them. And so that's what he advised, not only advised, he said it very strongly to Golda Meir. So Israel really was encouraged to sit back on their heels. This was the eve of Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is the holiest day in Judaism. It's a day when you fast literally for 25 hours. The majority, everything in Israel shuts down. All businesses are closed, buses don't run, nothing moves. And the people that aren't religious, they generally go to the park somewhere or go to the beach, but most people are in synagogues the whole time. So among other things, the Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt at the time, had concocted this plan, and he suckered in the other Arab countries, especially Syria. He didn't tell Syria what his real plan was. His plan was not to beat Israel in a war. He knew he couldn't do that. But what he wanted to do was gain enough honor by attacking them and knocking them back as far as he could, and then calling for a ceasefire. That way he could regain the honor that he felt the Egyptians had lost in the 67 war. But he didn't tell that to the Syrians, or the Syrians would never have gotten into the war. And so he misled his Arab partners so that they would attack from the north while he's attacking from the south. So it was a real double game that was being played. Now, they had done this. Egypt had made it look like they were going to attack numerous times in the preceding years. And so it looked like it could be just another feint that they were going to do. But every time they did that, Israel had to call up their reserves. And the Israeli army, even today, is pretty much made up of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. These are young men and women just out of high school. And then the officer corps is there, and many of the sergeant majors. These are older folks, but for the most part, it's a very young army. The idea is all of the reservists are basically civilians, but they're in the reserves. So if they are attacked, you call up all the reserves. That means all the businesses close where they're working. And in those days, every time they mobilized like that, it cost $11 million to the economy. Now that was big bucks at that time, especially to Israel's economy. And it was really forcing them into an inflationary cycle. And so after a while, they said, we just can't, every time Egypt looks like they're going to attack, we can't just fall for it. So we've got to have real intel. Now, the American intel did not read this properly. I know personally in 1972, a year before this, I was asking our intel people what would happen if the Arab countries would attack Israel. And they had run all of these scenarios on their computers, and these were great big computers at that time. And they said, look at this, Israel will be wiped out. There's no way they can win. So I want to say that in many ways, this was a miracle, because I'm giving it away, but Israel actually ended up winning the war. But it didn't look like that to begin with. Kissinger says, don't start the war, don't mobilize, don't do anything like that. And because this was Big Brother of the United States, and Israel was really dependent upon us, Israel listened to it. And by 2 p.m. in the afternoon, that's when Egypt attacked. The man in the middle with the pipe is Simcha Dinitz. And Dinitz was the Israeli ambassador to Israel at the time. And he played a big role as this war started to unravel. So it was quite quickly after the first few hours of the war that Israel realized how much they were in trouble, because the Egyptians and the Syrians were both supplied by the Russians. By this time, Egypt had kicked the Russians out, but nevertheless, all of their equipment was Russian, all of their training had been Russian, just as was the Syrians, all their tanks, everything was all Russian. And so They had missiles that were knocking Israeli planes out of the sky left and right. And Israel didn't have a big air force, and they were losing a great deal there. They were losing lots of tanks. There was an attack across the Suez Canal. The way Israel had protected themselves on the Israeli side of the canal was they had piled up sand. They had made mountains of sand. They had bunkers behind the sand. They had periscopes and everything so they could see over to the other side. But these mountains of sand looked like they were impregnable. And inside the mountains of sand were pipelines where they had gas and oil in those pipelines. And the idea was, if the Egyptians started coming across the canal, they would just shoot oil and gas into the canal and set it on fire to keep them back. Unfortunately, it had not been maintained, and when they needed it, it didn't work. But the mountains of sand were there, and they thought, well, this will slow them down so much that we can react if they ever try to come across the canal. And what they hadn't counted on was the fact that this was not the Egyptian army of 1967, which was easily defeated. This was the army of 1973, and they had been much better trained, much better equipped by all this Russian equipment, and they had this one secret. They had this idea that if they had heavy pumps that could pump the water out of the canal and fire it through these massive fire hoses against these mountains of sand, they could wash the sand away and they could make an inroads into Israel. And this is what they did. At 2 p.m., they started firing at the Israeli positions. And by the way, the Israeli positions were not fully manned because it was the eve of Yom Kippur. So in fact, Israel really, and they admit to this later, they had become arrogant. They had won the 1967 war in such a quick fashion that their idea of the Arab armies was very low. And so they sent everyone home on leave except the 18 and 19-year-old kids who had just come into the army. So there were just this one group of kids, for the most part, that were manning these bunkers along the canal. And so Israel was really not ready to repel. And so when the Egyptians started firing on the positions and their Air Force started bombing the area, and the boats started coming across the canal, and they started washing down these mountains of sand where they made, and they were also laying bridges so their tanks could come across. It was a real scare to Israel. They had not planned on countering that at all. And this is when the word got back to Golda that the war was on, and they had to then call up all of their reservists. It really worked out. It was much easier to find them because it was Yom Kippur than any other day, because the most part, they were either in the synagogues or they were reachable by phone. So everybody started running to get to their units. Now, one of the problems was Israel did not have the kind of locomotion to move their troops. They didn't have enough army trucks and buses and things like that. So they had to use civilian buses. They had to use the Egged buses to get to the front. So you're taking civilian buses off of the road and you're driving these troops all the way to the front in the Sinai, through the desert, off road. All of this stuff was really almost pretty makeshift. I mean, they'd planned for it if they had to do it, but it wasn't the best way to do it. Other things that were going on was they had not really been training since 1967. Usually our Israeli units would train several times a year where they'd come on weekends and they'd go through drills. They didn't do that. They thought, we beat them so easily the last time, we don't have to do that. So when troops got to their rallying points, the weapons weren't ready. All of this stuff, it was really a terrible mess that later on was investigated, and it really brought to the end Golda Meir's prime ministership. She resigned after the war, even though in some ways it was her fault, but not totally. Anyway, so Nimitz, who's in the middle, calls Kissinger and he says, we really need help. And this was a phone call that was very late in the evening. And Kissinger later tried to maintain that he immediately got this word to Nixon, but he didn't. He waited till 9 in the morning the next day before he brought the word to Nixon. Nixon reacted then in such a way that no one had ever seen him before. He said, find out exactly what they need and give them everything that we can give them. He said, you tell her, use up everything, use up your reserve ammo, use up all the planes you have. We'll replace everything that we can. And it kind of shocked Kissinger. So when Kissinger came back, Nixon said, what do you have on your list? What is it we have to send? And he started reading it off, and Nixon, this is on the tapes, he had a number of his famous words swearing about it. And he says, whatever you got on there, double it and send it right away. Now, what happened was, and you can, over in the far right-hand bottom corner is the Secretary of Defense. His name is James Schlesinger, hard word for me to say. And Schlesinger was a Jew, except he'd converted to Lutheranism. Now, Kissinger was a Jew, and these two didn't like each other very much. They were always trying to put the other one down in the background. These were really both politicians, and they'd bring out the knives and kind of undo all this stuff. Nixon had this problem with several people, and usually somebody like Schlesinger had one or two people right under him who were just like him. So the Secretary of Defense started slowing things down. He said, well, there's certain planes we can't get there. We're not allowed to do this. We're doing everything a bureaucrat could do to slow it down. He was not interested in obeying what Kissinger is telling him to do. And so the next day, Nixon wants to know, has any of that stuff left yet? And Kissinger said, well, no, it really hasn't, and then Nixon really blew his top. And it's some very colorful language on the tapes. And he jumped in there, unlike a president who doesn't do that. He just went crazy to get that stuff to Israel. Meanwhile, what he didn't even know about was this man over here in the middle in the photograph that is colored is Alexander Haig. And Alexander Haig was a retired 4-star general, and he was no longer in the chain of command. He was the chief of staff for Nixon. And many people think that during this time period and until Nixon resigned, it was Alexander Haig who really held the government together. And in many ways, he did that. And Haig, on his own, I want to say own recognizance, but it wasn't that, on his own, he started calling the bases in Europe and bases in the United States, even though he was no longer a 4-star general. And he started ordering them to get all of their equipment out of the warehouses and get it ready to fly to Israel. If he hadn't done that, the response would have been days longer. And praise God that Haig did that. Haig also had an impact later on in the Reagan presidency. Haig loved Israel, and he was very unique in doing that. So this is the airlift. It was an incredible airlift, and it lasted for 1 month. And Israel was really back on their heels when the first of the C-5 Galaxies landed there, and they were just this was our biggest plane ever, and it was one that you could see in that picture on the left hand. They could put tanks in there, they put airplanes in there, they put everything in there that Israel needed, and all kinds of, they did other things too. They had El Al Airlines was flying into the United States, but they had all these seats in there. So it was a problem to get lots of stuff into their flights. And then they were painting out the Star of David and different things like that. All kinds of things entered into this that made it difficult. But when Alexander Haig and Richard Nixon really got behind this push, then the Air Force really did a tremendous job. Some years ago, one of the men that we took to Israel with us had been in the Air Force, but when we got into Ben Gurion Airport, he said, "Wow, I haven't been here since '73." And I said, "You were here in '73?" He said, "Oh yeah, I was a co-pilot on one of those planes." And when the word got around through our friend, the former ambassador, that one of those pilots was with us every place we went, he really was honored. And he was embarrassed by this. He said, "I was just a co-pilot." They said, "No, you saved us." And as a matter of fact, that's how Golda Meir felt about Richard Nixon. And this picture on the left, this is after the war was over. Nixon was very enmeshed in Watergate, and he was really going down the drain. It was a very, very hard time for him mentally and all different ways. He took a trip to Israel while he was still president, and he was greeted as such a hero. It probably saved his mental health. And so this picture on the left was a press conference that Richard Nixon had with Golda Meir. She came very early in November. By the way, this war was in October. It was over Yom Kippur. And so they're standing there, and I don't know what was said, but he gave out the biggest horse laugh ever, and she was laughing too. It may have been the last time that Nixon really laughed in the White House, because it wasn't too much later that he resigned. But I really believe that God had him there for that very purpose. This next picture shows Alexander Haig in a civilian suit, because he was the chief of staff during those very sad days of Watergate. But he said this, and this is what he said about Israel. He said, "Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk. It does not carry even one American soldier, and it's located in a critical region for American national security." Now, the reason I bring that up, I mean, it's a heck of a statement, because it shows how under Nixon, we became much more tied to Israel. It was in 1970 that Nixon first paid attention to Israel. He saw things in the big picture, you know, going to China and Russia, and he saw this. He was a brilliant thinker when it came to this kind of strategy, but he paid no attention really to Israel. Now, the Syrians were making a move, and they were going to overrun Jordan. And as they started coming down with their army to overrun Jordan, and Jordan was an ally of ours at the time, Jordan, King Hussein of Jordan, called Britain, and he called the United States. He called Nixon, and he said, "You've got to help us." Nixon wasn't able to do anything because it was the wind down of Vietnam. It was a mess, something he couldn't do. And Britain couldn't do anything. And so it looked like Syria was going to overrun one of our allies. And then out of nowhere, Israel mobilized, and Israel pulled up on the border on the right flank of the Syrian army, and the Syrian army turned around and went back home. And Nixon goes, "Oh my gosh, there is an ally. There is somebody who has great power in the big game." And so it was from 1970 on that Nixon finally realized the importance. And as a matter of fact, that's when we really started becoming closer to Israel militarily and as a national security issue. And that was another step that brought us closer than ever before, when Nixon realized that. And that also was understood by the next president, who was Ronald Reagan. I'll tell you a very quick story here. These are prime ministers with our presidents. This is Menachem Begin, who was a short little man, standing with Reagan while their national anthems were being played. Here is after Begin quit the prime ministership, one of the co-prime ministers that came in was Yitzhak Shamir. And Yitzhak Shamir was even shorter than Begin. He stood about, I met him one time and I felt like a big guy. I would imagine he might have been about 5'2", but he was really tough as nails. He had been in the underground. He was a very feared terrorist by the British. But the story I want to tell you is that it wasn't with Reagan, but it was with the next president, George Bush, that Shamir came to Washington, D.C. And the next day he had to go in, and it was a meeting that was going to be terrible because it was with Bush, but it was with James Baker, who by that time was Bush's Secretary of State. And I don't mind not mincing any words here. Baker was an anti-Semite. He said terrible things about Israel and about Jews, and he really meant it. And he's still hanging around. I'm surprised that Biden doesn't have him back in the White House yet. But anyway, our friend who was an ambassador to the United States from Israel told me this story, and he's always told me true stories. And he said, make sure you don't tell anybody this story. So you're not hearing this story from me. He said the night before, Shamir came from Israel, and he met with a lot of the senators and congressmen. And as he was talking, this little man was talking, and the senators started passing this note around. And our friend Yoram, the ambassador, got hold of the note, and it said, "This guy is the meanest little son of a bitch in the valley." And the senators were all shaking their heads. Now, Yoram had it, but it was a very bad time for Israel. And so when the senators left, Yoram stayed, and he said Shamir was really down in the dumps. He looked very sad. He wasn't peppy as he usually was. And Yoram said, "Mr. Prime Minister, could I stay a minute? I need to tell you something." And Shamir said, "Can it wait till tomorrow? I'm really tired. He said, "I don't think it should. And maybe when I get done telling you this, you're going to send me home. But I feel that I ought to." And Shamir said, "Okay, what is it?" And he said, "Well, there was a note passing around among these leaders, and they said, 'You are the toughest little son of a bitch in the whole valley.'" And Shamir looked very quizzically at him like, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Well, sir, it means, I hope you don't mind if I say it this way, that you're somebody who has the biggest cojones in the whole valley." He said, "What does that mean?" And then Yoram explained that to him in Hebrew. And he says, "Cojones, really?" And he said, Shamir started getting taller and taller. And he's going, "They say I'm the biggest, I got big cojones." He said, "Yes, tomorrow, remember this when you go in against George Bush and against James Baker, that you're that toughest little son of a bitch in the whole." He said, "Thank you very much." And he was so pepped up by that remark from that one thing there that it changed everything in his attitude. It also changed everything in the next round that comes up. Lori, is the connection too bad?
No, it's fine. You're still, every once in a while it'll pop up, you'll slow down and you'll speed up, but it's not unbearable. It's fine. It's fine.
Okay. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to jump into Ronald Reagan, who is the next president in that book, who did something good for Israel. Ronald Reagan never visited Israel, and there were a lot of bumpy roads while he was president, and yet he truly was a Teflon president, because those of us that were supportive of Reagan and his relationship to Israel, even though there were lots of bumps in the road, it showed that that connection between Israel and the United States could stand that. And it started very early in Reagan's presidency, and Saddam Hussein was building a nuclear weapon in Baghdad, and the place was called the Osirik reactor. And the Osirik reactor was definitely being built to build a nuclear weapon that was going to be used by Saddam Hussein against Israel. Now, Menachem Begin, the other short little prime minister who didn't look tough, but was mentally so tough, and I have such great respect for him, was the prime minister. And he brought in the leader of the opposition, who was a very peace-oriented guy named Shamir. And no, I don't have that right. That's not true. It wasn't Shamir. It was, I'll think of it. He was sharing the, never mind. He brought him in and he briefed the opposition. It would be like Biden bringing in whoever the leader of the Republicans would be now. I suppose it would be McConnell, bringing him and giving him a top secret briefing. And then McConnell would run right out to the newspapers and tell the whole thing. Well, Begin revealed that they were getting ready to attack the Osirik reactor in Iraq. And Peres, Shimon Peres was the leader. Later, he became prime minister also. But anyway, he was brought in, and the first thing he did was he went out and he blabbed it. And so Israel had to pull back and not do it. And time was of the essence, because they couldn't really know when the nuclear reactor would really go online. And they couldn't hit it then, because they were afraid if they hit it then, it would release nuclear fallout all over the Middle East, and they didn't want to do that. So Begin was under great pressure. The night before they went out to take care of this problem, he had everybody come to his office. And he was always very neat. He was dressed, always had a tie on. And so he asked everyone, the head of the Air Force, the head of Mossad, the head of all the different departments, okay, I want you to tell me, do you think we can actually do this? Everyone stood up and they either said, don't do it because the world will hate us, or it can't be done. And they made a good presentation. Then Begin stood up and he thanked them all for being so honest in their idea about this raid. And he said, even though I think you know that I'm for this, and you all really came out against this. The head of the Air Force had his head hanging because they had trained for this for a long time. And Begin said, even though you're all against it, we have to do it, and we're going tomorrow. And that was the decision. He made that decision against all of his advisors. And so that next morning, the Israeli Air Force took off. Now, it wasn't the whole Air Force. It was 14 planes. And there were 6 F-16s. The planes that you see up here, these are F-16s. And this is the F-15. And the F-15s were the escort. They were the fighters. They're called the Eagles. And the F-16s were the strike aircraft, and they had the bombs on them. Now, they took off from Israel. They flew at a very low altitude, just right above the sand, and they went across the Red Sea. And as they went across the Red Sea, they flew right over a yacht that was there. And the yacht was the yacht of King Hussein of Jordan. King Hussein was also an experienced pilot. As soon as he saw those planes going over him, he knew exactly that they were going to Iran. He tried to call Saddam Hussein, and warn him, but he couldn't get the phone call through. Then the Israeli planes flew across Saudi Arabia. The pilots did not speak unless they were speaking in Arabic. And so they were queried by the air traffic controllers, and they were flying in such a tight formation that it looked like a 747. And one of the Israeli pilots answered in Arabic. He said, well, we're just a little bit off course. We're going to make the change. And so they kept going. They never figured out that these were 14 Israeli planes going right over the top of them. And so they flew in to Baghdad, and they were about to, I'll show you the pattern that they took. This is where they flew. They flew out of Israel, across the Red Sea, and then across Saudi Arabia and headed right straight toward Baghdad. Of course, they had never been there before. They were only using photographs that they had from satellites, and there'd been rain. And so the rain had formed lakes that weren't on the photo. And so they weren't exactly sure where they were. And then they realized that they were almost going to overfly their target. And so what they did next was, I thought I had it here, but anyway, the pattern that they did was they raced up off of the floor of the desert and then dove toward this one building, which was this nuclear reactor, this building for the nuclear reactor. And the F-16s went in and they bombed it. The other planes were to protect them. So they flew out and they overshadowed all of this in case the Iranian Air Force went up after them. And so after the first pilot overshot, and then he turned around, did a loop-de-loop, and he went back again after his other pilots had gone in and made their attack. And so in a very short period of time, now as soon as they came up on the radar, the Iranians who were manning the anti-aircraft weapons ran back to their anti-aircraft weapons. The reason they weren't there was the attack was planned for the time that they went to supper. And so they had shut down all of their radar and they'd all gone to supper. Well, immediately when they hear the planes, they run back and they start shooting. Well, they started shooting straight up in the air because they didn't want to be accused of not manning their aircraft weapons. And most of the casualties that occurred were from their bullets coming straight down on top of them. And so, but the Israeli aircraft made the turnaround and started back toward Israel. The real problem was they didn't have enough gas. And they had attached these exterior gas tanks to their planes. And then when they ran out of gas, they dropped them to get rid of the weight. And they're probably still out in the desert there somewhere. And then they finally made it back into Israel and they all landed. The next morning, when they attempted to bring these planes out and start them up, not one of the planes could start. They had come in absolutely on fumes, but they had done away with this. Now, Reagan's answer to this was he was at Camp David when this occurred, and he was called by his national security advisor as he was getting on a helicopter. And the national security advisor said, "Mr. President, I have to tell you that Israel has attacked Iran." What? Yes, they've attacked. And then it was very quiet for a while. And Reagan thought, and then he said in the Reagan-esque way of speaking, he said, "Well, boys will be boys." And I wish it had stayed that way. But by the time he got back to Washington, his cabinet, made up of a lot of people like George H.W. Bush and others, and Caspar Weinberger, who himself was Jewish and was honestly, in my opinion, was an enemy of Israel in many ways. These people said, we've got to really clobber Israel for doing this. They should have told us all about this. And so for the next few days, we stopped supplying them. We really went to the UN. Basically, we were going to condemn them in the UN, but it didn't quite go through. And then this secret document was found. And basically, I won't read the whole thing to you, but what this secret document says was that the Jimmy Carter administration knew what Israel was going to do. They had kind of given them the green light, but they had neglected to tell the Reagan administration when they came in. So they kind of had egg on their face, but they also had somebody to blame, and it was Jimmy Carter, who has turned out to be quite an enemy of Israel over the years. And it was just kind of another thing he did, which was very hard for Reagan to take over. This is a picture of Reagan as a child. And of course, you know what he looked like later. I may have run out of time here. Reagan certainly was a blessing to Israel, because later on, he did away with all these things that he said he was going to do to Israel. And being the Teflon president, he was very much liked by Israel. And still, I think there's much more to it. If you want to read the book, you'll find out a lot more about Reagan. And then next week, I hope that we can spend the entire time on Donald Trump, because no president has been a blessing to Israel like Donald Trump has.
That's right. That's right. Wow. Okay. Thank you, John. What another outstanding presentation. I think we have a few minutes. Let's take about 5 or 10 minutes and, allow someone to ask a question if something has popped up. So if you want to take your screen off so we can see whoever wants to ask a question, if there is someone out there, we'll go ahead and get ready to do a little Q&A session. Fascinating history. I had never heard of that attack in Baghdad. But what I have heard is there's no Air Force like the Israeli Air Force. And even back then, they were quite impressive, and I know they are today as well. Okay, very good. So let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Let me turn on gallery view. If you have a question for John, now is your chance to ask. Maybe from last week's presentation, which was fantastic about LBJ, and then tonight's presentation. Let's see. Doug, it looks like you're getting ready to ask a question. Do you have a question? You can unmute yourself.
I kind of do, but I just don't know how to say it. So let me just kind of shoot. It seems as if God is continually putting people in places of power that are able to accomplish what he wants done, whether or not the president or anybody else in control really agrees with that or not. So how is the best way to pray in our current situation for the land of Israel? I know I pray a lot for the peace of Jerusalem because we're directed to in the scriptures. We're also praying for their protection as a country. But do you have any idea of the best way to pray for the relationship we have and for the country of Israel itself?
You know, I've asked that of a very good friend of mine who is a Messianic rabbi, lives in Israel, had been in the Israeli army. We've become friends years ago over baseball. And I remember out jogging with him one day, and he's always ready to talk rather than jog very much. And so as we were jogging along, I said, David, I try to pray for Israel all the time, but I never really know what to pray for and all these kind of things. And he said, well, let's stop for a minute. And he said, one of the things about that word to pray is not just folding your hands and praying. He said, every time you send me an email or ask me what's going on in Israel, that's part of this idea of praying for Israel. You're getting informed about it. And as you understand these things, it touches your heart, so you can pray that way. I know that every morning at 5 o'clock our time, there's a station that's called the JBS, Jewish Broadcasting System. And I'm sure it's 8 o'clock in New York where it comes from, but there's Israeli news on at 5 in the morning. And my wife and I are always watching this. And it's kind of up-to-date stuff. Plus, I usually go to the Jerusalem Post online and these kind of things and see what's going on there. And then and I have a couple of radio shows, so when I talk about that, by that time it's much deeper in my mind and in my heart. And that's how I pray for Israel. I pray that God will also have people like these 5 presidents I wrote about. Maybe they don't have to be presidents, but somebody who can get to the people that make the decisions. And I found this, every one of these people, there's a whole connection of things that happened early in life. And usually it's one person somehow says something to somebody else, touches somebody's heart, and you've got a Harry Truman. You've got a Lyndon Johnson. As crude and as of all these presidents, the one that I wouldn't have wanted to be around was Lyndon Johnson. And yet there was a whole stream of people in his life who had him set up. When he was president in 1967, he made the big jump that brought us much closer to Israel than the others did. And then Donald Trump, of course, is in a world all by himself. But we'll talk about the connections that brought Trump to where he is today and where he was to do the kind of things for Israel that he was able to do in those 4 years. So get more informed on this whole issue, because this issue has the greatest to do with the future of our country. We're either going to stand with them or we're going to sell them out like every other nation has done in the past. And none of us, I'm sure, that are listening tonight want that to happen. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Great answer too. Thank you. I think that's so true about being informed. What I'll do when I email the recording of tonight out, I will add a few Israeli news sources that myself and John both watch. I also am dialed into JBS. I've learned so much from that channel over the last 5 or 6 years. And I also will add some Israeli news sites that I keep up with, and I'm sure John does too, in addition to the Jerusalem Post, which, by the way, they're kind of left-leaning right now. I'm really aggravated with them, but anyway. Yeah. So it is what it is. But anyway, any other questions? That was great. Thanks, Doug.
I'll just say one other thing. Carolyn Glick.
Yes.
Someone we know, and we've had her here. She is an incredible writer and author, and she used to be the editor of the Jerusalem Post. If you can find her, and she's easy to find on the internet, she writes wonderful stuff.
Let me grab a book I have of hers real quick to share with y'all. Y'all might want to get this book. She wrote called The Israeli Solution by Caroline Glick. This is actually my friend Dennis's book, who's on the call tonight. Dennis, thanks for loaning me your book. But this is, she's incredible. And I just wrote down the name of the paper that she contributes to now. She's also been a contributor to Breitbart. But yeah, she is a great person to follow. I agree, 100%. Thank you.
Question there?
What's that?
I've been listening through it. So we know what the leadership is doing, which is not the heart of the people. And so other than us praying and again, taking action and doing these things, when the heart of the people is so much different than the heart of the leadership, I know God's going to pay attention to that, but how do you see that working out for blessing Israel?
I guess in my mind, the thing that calms me down, which is yeah, my wife's going, oh yeah, calms him down, is that God has a plan, and it's much bigger than anything I can understand. And if we pray and get our minds to say that we're in conjunction with that plan, God, we don't have to know all about it. And standing for Israel and doing these kind of things. Maybe I mentioned this before, but it really blessed me. And forgive me if I said this before, but when I came out of the post office a couple of months ago, there was a guy standing by my truck. He said, "This your truck?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, look at this truck. You got a Marine Corps sticker on it. You got another sticker that says Trump, and you got another sticker that says, I stand with Israel. You are the whole package." And I'm glad he didn't try to wrap me up and take me home, but I thought that was quite a statement that someone else also connects that way. And my wife and I have noticed there's very few bumper stickers anymore. People just don't have them. And but we do. I mean, we're not loaded with 40 bumper stickers on there. You know, that's kind of wacky. But one says a lot. And if one says Israel, that says a lot. And do you know how much that blesses other people who are pro-Israel? Do you know how much it blesses Israelis who are visiting here? And we often, not now because of COVID, but we have a friend who lives along the main highway. Highway 41 runs up to Yosemite, and she's always flying an Israeli flag. More Israelis will stop at her house just to wonder why she has that. And it's a blessing. We can be a blessing to people like that. And so my friend David Simmons in Weatherford, he flies an Israeli flag out in front of his church. And this is a blessing to Israelis who are in our nation. And they often feel like, oh boy, we are just surrounded by all these people who vote against us and all that stuff. And they are so blessed to meet people like us. Anyway, I don't think there was a question there. I just started rambling. Please, if you have a
Well,
question.
no, let me add to that. What you're saying is to express it, to be verbal. This is not the time to be silent. This is absolutely the time to be vocal and express our beliefs and our positions, because like John says, it encourages others that are already thinking that way. And that's just how, I think, John, you kind of mentioned this when you gave the presentation over the UK, you said things began to turn around back in the right direction when people started like wearing certain jewelry or certain things, expressing their position, going against the leadership. And this is going to sound kind of weird because it's not really what you're saying, but it is, meaning express your unity with Israel. That is what you're saying in some way, I think. Am I right?
Oh yeah, I think so. I almost always on my jacket somewhere, I have either a Texas Israel pin. Thank you, Ann Stacy.
Yes.
I could use a few more.
Yeah.
Hint, hint. And or an American flag and Israeli flag with it.
That's right.
Always. And so does Mary, or she's always wearing some Israeli jewelry.
That's right.
Especially that's noticed by Jews.
That's right.
And most of the Jews we run into are Reformed Jews. They're very, very liberal on these kind of things. But we went to a funeral the other day, and it was for a Jewish lady who was really a wonderful person, very supportive of Israel. And it seemed like everybody there was all on the same wavelength. Matter of fact, people during the ceremony wanted to come up and start talking Trump to me. And I said, hey, it's a funeral. Well, it was a person who stood for those kind of things. but they only knew who we were basically because we're wearing something from Israel. And you can do that. And you should do it. If you're for Israel, yeah, see, it's a blessing to people who feel that they're all alone and they're just going to kind of hide it. Well, you can encourage them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, John. That's fantastic. All right. Anybody else want to add to that or ask another question? How do we move forward? How do we position ourselves individually or locally to stand with Israel? And I think all of those that John suggested are great, for sure. So, okay, it doesn't look like there's any other question. So, go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeanette.
I just, you know, I understand that we're supporting them, but the Israeli flag is our flag. I mean, we may be living in the United States but if we're grafted in, this is our flag. It's
Yeah.
not a separate flag. It's us. Why? So we don't want to be treating it differently. And I'm thinking even here, I mean, I'm originally born Canadian, but I've been here for 30 years.
She's been redeemed.
I've been warmed up. That's what it is. And I keep looking at this. It's like when we're in Revelation, we're going to Jerusalem. And the earth is one circle again. It appears that there's no oceans. We're one country. We're not across the ocean from anybody. We're one. Why I'm asking myself first, why am I treating it as though it's another country? Hebrew is my first language. By adoption, I haven't learned it yet. But why don't I know my first language? I ask myself.
Yeah. Well, those are
Sorry.
some interesting insights. Learning to speak Hebrew, I'll give you a quick suggestion. It's called the Pimsleur method, Pimsleur. It's the best method I've seen to learn Hebrew. And if you want to do it, and it's not like so you can read Hebrew, it's conversational Hebrew. And they're about half-hour lessons. And they're wonderful. They start out, it's very basic, and they build a little bit, and then you get to the point where, oh, you don't quite get it, and then they go right back almost to the beginning, and it builds your confidence again. They're wonderful. You can get them on CDs. Pimsleur, Pimsleur. He was a professor at Ohio State. Thank you. It's very worthwhile. The first time I used them, maybe it was about 6 months, and I was teaching and coaching at some different schools. So I had a half an hour drive to the one school, a half an hour drive from there, and then another half hour home. So I would have these Pimsleur CDs playing, and it was just the time of my trips. And you're driving, you can't totally concentrate on it. After about 6 weeks, I went to Jerusalem, and I was sitting in the office of a friend of mine, and she was running a hotel, and she's on the phone, speaking in Hebrew, carrying on. And when she got off the phone, I started telling her what she was talking about in Hebrew. And she's, oh my gosh, now I can't say anything around you.
That's awesome.
So it's a wonderful method. And I tried a lot of other, even government programs to learn Hebrew, and it just went nowhere. This has been the best. So anyway, that's for free.
Thanks, John. I want to add to that too, just in response to your comment about Israeli flag. I'm sorry, what was your first name again? Karen?
My name is Jeanette.
Jeanette. Sorry, Jeanette. My apologies. I think that what you said was interesting as well, but I think that is more of a theological thought and question and comment. And this certainly is totally okay. But for those who may not have that same perspective, at the very least, what we're trying to accomplish is on a political level, our country needs to stand with Israel. Whether we have that same theological perspective or not, it doesn't, you know what I'm saying? Because for some people, they're still learning all the history of Israel and the history of our country related to Israel. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish here, is to really not to convince someone one way or the other about theological stuff, which that's not a bad thing, but our goal is just to get people on board with the history and the reasons that we as from a political position need to stand with Israel. It's all going to point back to theology, anyway, but in the end. So
And it's been wonderful listening to it and catching all the background of it, because I agree with what I'm hearing.
yeah.
And like you say, it's like,
Yeah.
thank you. Really appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm glad. It's all good. All right. Anybody else have anything?
I want to echo that. I really appreciate that thought, because on my flagpole out in front of my house, I've got the American flag, and then I have the Texas flag, and then I have the Israeli flag, and then I have the Marine Corps flag. And I think I'm going to run up the Trump flag, which I have taken in from the road. So I'm overloaded, but it's a good reason. If somebody says, why are you flying that Israeli flag? You said, oh, because I've been grafted in. Now, if they don't know what you're talking about and they ask you, you have an opportunity to tell them that. I love that response. Thank you. I'm going to be stealing it.
Well, it's so funny. On my patio, I have a balcony. I have an American flag and I have an Israeli flag flying. And recently I was out on my patio and I live on the 4th floor. So I looked down and there was a girl walking on the trail with her dog. And she looked up and she said, is that an Israeli flag? And I said, yes. Have you ever been? She said, I'm from Israel. Are you kidding? I love you. So she said, she's living here in Austin. And so anyway, it's so true. You put a flag out, you're going to make friends. It's so fun.
That's
so
great.
Fun. It is an interesting life. When you align yourself with Israel and the Jewish people, it is an interesting life. You will meet the most interesting people. You will be enriched. You will it's just put me on a whole new trajectory of life that I would not give up in 1 second for anything. So very interesting. Thank you, guys. Okay, I don't see everybody, anyone else raising their hand for questions. I think we're at a good stopping point. Next week is, like John said, he's going to be covering President Trump, our biggest friend to Israel as a president for our country. So I'm very excited to hear that. And then I'll be announcing next week who our next speaker is going to be for the month of February. And I'm very excited. It is someone from Israel, and they'll be joining us from Israel. So you'll want to hear more about that. All right. I think we're at a good point to say goodnight. And so thanks for joining us, and we will see y'all next Thursday. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
So appreciate it.
Yeah. Good night.
It was phenomenal.